What I want to talk about now is the consequences of this first era of globalisation. And I'll do that in several parts. First consequence I want to talk about is economic growth. So it seems generally accepted that this first era of globalisation was in a variety of ways associated with an improvement in economic well-being, with more rapid economic development. The trade that was part of this first era of globalisation facilitated extra specialisation and the benefits that brings, and also the era brought a diffusion of knowledge in technology that would benefit the countries that received that knowledge. But the fact that there might have been overall gains from increases in connectedness between countries doesn't mean that all countries, or doesn't mean that everyone within a particular country gained from that. In fact, usually we think of a process of increasing the connectedness or globalisation between countries as being associated with winners and losers. And we can think of that both within country and between country. Within countries, Stolper-Samuelson theory, which is a theory about what happens to distribution of well-being in a country when you increasingly open up to, for example, international trade, can tell us about what the likely effects of this opening up would have been. For example, suppose we think of land-abundant, labour-scarce countries such as the United States or Australia or Canada. The Stolper-Samuelson theory predicts that when you increase the amount of international trade, countries will specialise more in the production activities in which they have a comparative advantage. For countries such as the United States and Australia, the activities in which they had a comparative advantage were the activities, the production activities that were intensive in land. That is, that needed a lot of the input that they had a lot of, which was land. So when you open up to international trade, what it means is that Europe starts to specialise more in producing industrial goods. Countries such as the United States, Australia, and New Zealand will specialise more, other things equal, in producing the types of goods that are intensive in land. So things like wool production, grain production, meat production. Now that increase in demand for goods which rely a lot on land, but which don't rely so much on other inputs such as labour, for example, means that you get an increase in the relative demand for land because you're doing more production activities that need more land, and you're going to have a decrease in the relative demand for labour, which because you're doing production activities that need relatively less labour. So that suggests to us that landowners are going to be made better off because there's more demand for the input they own, and workers are going to be made worse off because there's less demand for the input they own. And by and large, that seems to sort of describe the pattern of outcomes that occurred from this first era of globalisation in places like Australia, New Zealand and America. And it explains why, for example, that labour in those countries began to oppose immigration because immigration was seen as a factor that was compounding this disadvantage that was occurring because of the shift in the nature of production. The other aspect of winners and losers is that there were countries that gained overall, but it seems that there were countries that lost overall from this period as well. And the main example that's usually used during this period, or identified during this period, is the deindustrialisation that occurred in India and China. So if we go back to before the Industrial Revolution, you can see that India and China were major producers of manufacturing output. China producing a third of the world's manufactured output, India a quarter, and the developed core only 25%. But fast forward to 1913 and 90% of the world's output of manufactured goods is being produced in the developed core. India is only producing 1% and China is only producing 3.6%. What's happened in the meantime is that you've obviously had the Industrial Revolution, which has raised the relative capacity of the developed core to produce manufactured goods, lowered the cost at which they can do that, and then the expansion of international trade has given them the capacity to sell that output to other parts of the world and to compete against India and China in selling to the rest of the world, or selling to India and China as well against India and Chinese manufacturers. And so the first year of globalisation allows these countries which have experienced the Industrial Revolution to displace manufacturing firms in India and China as suppliers of manufactured output to the world. So while clearly that was a process that benefited that developed core, it was also a process which was disadvantageous to India and China, and arguably set back their paths to economic development. Second aspect of this first year of globalisation that I want to talk about, and I talked about this a little bit at the start of the last part of the lecture, is colonialism. So the Industrial Revolution creates military asymmetries via technology, via income, via population size, which are then exploited, in particular by the United Kingdom, France and Russia. So Europe, in fact, increases the proportion of the world's surface that it controls from 37% in 1800 to 84% in 1914. Now, it uses this control, this imperial power that it has, in a couple of different ways. Sometimes what it does is it forces freer trading conditions with the part of the world that it's gone to and usually used military force against. So, for example, after the Opium Wars, the Treaty of Nanking between Britain and China expands British scope to trade with China. The other model for use of imperial power was basically to expropriate resources, where a classic case is Belgian Congo and rubber. So in the 1880s, King Leopold of Belgium is basically given the right by other European powers in the United States to have a monopoly over economic activity in that region. The model Leopold develops is one of basically using military force to enslave the local population to produce ivory and then rubber to be exported to Europe. And this is an exercise that basically involves expropriation of resources from this part of the world without payment back to Belgium and Europe, and basically imposes huge human cost on that area of the world. So a fantastic book about this episode is Adam Hochschild's book, King Leopold's Ghosts. This is a photo which shows a father looking at the severed hands of his daughter. And as Hochschild notes in his book, the severing hands was deliberate policy. Basically, if the military went to a village and there was a refusal by the people in that village to assist them in order to set an example for other nearby villages, basically the village, there would be mass slaughter, sometimes sort of decapitation, sometimes sort of, if it was a local militia working, they would cut the hands off as evidence to use to the Belgian authorities that they had actually killed a particular number of people in that village to discipline them as an example to other villages to basically be enslaved to produce rubber. So it's estimated that about 10 million people, 10 million of the indigenous population of the Belgian Congo died in the period from the 1880s through to the early 20th century, which is about half the population. And Hochschild talks movingly about what he calls the great forgetting, which is, as he expresses it, dominating part of the city's skyline is the grandest Congo-financed extravagance of all. The huge Cinquantenaire arch, studded with heroic statuary. Brussels, the city he's talking about, is not unique. In Berlin, there are no museums or monuments to the slaughtered heroes. In the American South, there are hundreds of Civil War battle monuments and preserved plantation manor houses for every exhibit that in any way marks the existence of slavery. And yet the world we live in, its divisions and conflicts, its widening gap between rich and poor, is shaped far less by the events we celebrate and mythologise than by the painful events we seek to forget. And I think this is a really important quote in two ways. First of all, that even if we were just telling the economic history of Europe and other richer countries, as we've been doing in the course up until now, it's important to remember that there was this other side to economic development during this period, that we can never afford to be too triumphalist about improvements in economic development. But as Hochschild suggests as well, and as we'll see as we move to increasingly examine the economic experience of other parts of the world in the rest of the course, what happened in these areas that Europe colonised has cast a long shadow in terms of their economic performance, for example, in the 20th century. The third consequence I want to talk about is the effect on prices and wages in the West and Western offshoot. So here I've sort of reproduced the chart that I had used in the last section of this part of the lecture, showing cost of distance, government policy, underlying conditions as driving changes in inter-country flows of goods and capital. What I'm sort of also noting here is that this has an extra consequence, that these flows are going to drive inter-country price differences in prices, wages and interest rates. And also, as I'll talk about, price differentials between inputs within a country. So first of all, if we think of sort of the effect of this growth in connectedness on inter-country price differences. Basically what we would expect is that decreases in the cost of transport should reduce the price differential at which, for example, grain sells in America versus Europe, decreases the difference in wages between, for example, Europe and a country like Australia, and also decreases the interest rate differentials, or the differential on the return on financial instruments and assets between different countries, because of the improvement in information dissemination about what's happening in different financial markets. And by and large, that's the pattern we observe occurring during this first year of globalisation. Here I've got sort of several examples of commodities. Wheat generally traded sort of from or sold from America to Europe. You can see that in 1870 the percentage price difference was wheat was 57% more expensive in Liverpool and Chicago, but as we get the first year of globalisation, the decrease in transport costs, that price differential falls. Similarly, meat, animal fats, that went from America to Europe, and the price differential, it used to be that meat sold for some item of meat, sold for like a pound of beef, say, sold for 100% more almost in London than Cincinnati. But by 1913, that price differential is 18%. Another example is iron bars. Iron bars were going in the opposite direction, from Europe, in this case London, to America, Philadelphia. And you can see that there's a similar pattern there. In 1870, the price of the standard iron bar was 75% higher in Philadelphia than it was in London. But by 1913, the price differential was only about 10%. So we get narrowing price differentials in commodity markets during this period. We also get narrowing wage differentials. So this is the average wage in different countries relative to Britain, and you can see that during the period sort of from 1870 through to the early 20th century, basically there's this pattern of, on average, a select group of other countries, their wages are converging towards the wage in Britain increasing. The same thing happened in capital markets, where interest rate differentials in returns on financial assets narrowed during this first era of globalisation. The other way in which globalisation changed input prices was within countries. And so this relates to a point that I talked about earlier in this section of the lecture, the idea that opening up to international trade would change the relative demand for different inputs. And so I talked about how in land abundant labour scarce countries like Australia and the United States, there'd be an increase in relative demand for land and a decrease in the relative demand for labour. So what we'd expect then is that change in relative demand for land and labour should increase the price of land and decrease the price of labour relative to each other. So in other words, the price of land should increase relative to labour, or the price of labour relative to land, just the reverse, should decrease. And that's what we see happening in those land-abundant countries. So from the 1870s to World War I, we see basically Australia and the United States, the price of labour compared to land falls. So exactly consistent with the pattern that's predicted that when you open up to trade, these countries specialise more in land-abundant, labour-scarce production activity, and that changes the relative returns to those inputs. Whereas in Europe, which was land scarce and labour abundant, what they do is they begin to specialise more in industrial production activities which require relatively more labour. So there you get the opposite. You get an increase in the relative demand for labour and a decrease in the relative demand for land, because Europe is specialising more in labour-intensive production activities. So what should that do? Well, that should increase the relative price of labour, decrease the relative price of land. So the price of labour relative to land should increase. And in fact, that's what we see occurring in those European countries during that period. So we get international price differences narrowing, and we get changes in prices within countries that reflect the influence of international trade. Now, this first era of globalisation comes to an end around World War I, and there's a couple of reasons why that occurs. First of all, there's the disruption caused by World War I and the Great Depression, which cause obviously countries to cease trading with each other, cause disruption to the scope for flows due to migration, and cause governments to shut down international trade on some occasions as a way of protecting their own local economies. The other reason that the first era of globalisation comes to an end, I think, is because of political economy factors. Basically, towards the end of this period, governments begin to adopt policies which are increasingly intended to actually restrict the extent of connectedness between countries. And to a large degree, that can probably be attributed to the rise in the political influence of the working class. So in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the working class increasingly enfranchised, increasingly able to influence government policy making. And they have particular interests. For example, the working class are damaged by free immigration. So immigration adds to the labour supply, and other things equal that lowers wages. So working class in a country would tend to lobby against immigration. So you can see the restrictions on immigration that are increasingly imposed by countries such as the United States and Australia in the late 19th, early 20th century reflect this concern about the interests of the working class. The demise of the gold standard around this time reflects the fact that the working class bear the costs of the type of policy that the gold standard needed to sustain adherence to it, which we'll talk about more in the next section of this lecture. The working class are predominantly in industrial type jobs, And so they're concerned about international competition for import competing industrial goods. And so again, that becomes a basis for increasing protection against international trade. So political economy factors, the change in the balance of political power, increasing influence of the working class seems to have led to the adoption of policies that worked against this first era of globalisation and ultimately contributed to its end. In the next section of this lecture, we'll talk about the one particular aspect of this first era of globalisation, and a very important part, the gold standard.